Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Last week, Ireland went to the polls for a general election, and as results still trickle in, a real test of my long-held support for STV, by the way, the time it's taking, we are starting to get some impressions as to what the next government of Ireland may look like. To discuss the campaign, the results, and what this all means for our friends to the West, we are joined by Lila Haines, a researcher and author who literally wrote the book on Irish political parties, and Dr. Alexander Fitzpatrick, who is the researcher at the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy at the Wales Governance Centre. Hello, both.
Hello.
Hello.
So let's set the scene. Lila, who was governing Ireland before the election, and why was this election called?
The outgoing government was made up of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, who had a rotating prime ministership, Taoiseach position, and the Green Party, which had 12 members, the 33rd Dáil, but I'm afraid it's not been a good day for them.
This election, rather like the looming Welsh one, Alex, has an expanded parliament. So the total number of seats in the Dáil has risen from 160 to 174. What's the story behind that?
The Electoral Commission did a review of the seats. I think it's in the Constitution that there's a minimum and maximum number of constituents per Teachta Dála, TD, or MP, as you'd call them in the UK. So I believe there has to be one TD. I think 20,000 is the minimum and 30,000 is the maximum. And so to ensure representative proportionality, they have to increase. So it's gone from 160 to 178 this round.
I can only imagine what the reaction to anything like that in the UK would be. I can't imagine it would be a positive one. Lila, you've obviously written the book on this, but for our listeners who haven't listened to your previous appearances on our pod, and for those who don't know, can you briefly set out the main parties contesting this election and what the Irish political spectrum looks like in comparison to the one we're used to in Wales and the UK?
Well, I've already named the two main parties who were in government up to now and still are until a new government is agreed. That's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who were traditionally known as the Civil War parties because they came from the two opposite sides of the Civil War that followed independence, opposing and accepting the agreement, the treaty reached with Lord George's government in London. The Labour Party, which has been in existence from the early 20th century as well, I would argue really effectively from 2018, though some people say earlier, was at times the third party in government, quite often over the years. So we had what was tended to be referred to as a 2.5-party system. Labour helping out to make sure that the state moves steadily on and introducing some pretty progressive policies as condition of their joining in various governments. There were others as well from time to time who did that, but none of them are still in existence. Then we have the party that now holds the Sinn Féin title, which is probably recognised pretty well as the fifth iteration of that party. And they were, for 30-ish years, the voice of the provisional IRA. It's wonderful, and that's a very quick value judgment, but I think a few people would disagree. It's wonderful that they are now working peacefully in a political system. That doesn't mean they don't try to destabilise it, north or south. And some people will know, but others may not, that Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland gained the first minister post last year. Was it? At my age, when the years become shorter, so that was a bit of a breakthrough, but it was also a recognition of the British system, of things that they wouldn't have touched with a barge pole or a long-range rifle many years ago, and that it is in itself a change we have seen over recent years. Then at the moment, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin are the three big parties. However, this election has brought some emerging, interesting changes. while there is a big gap between those three and the next tier down, we've now got two parties pretty well neck and neck. Last time I looked, with 11 seats each. That's the Labour Party, which is the rump of the traditional Labour Party, and the Social Democrats, which was formed in 2015, arising mainly out of the Labour Party, but not fully. The three founders, one had been a minister, Labour minister. Another woman, Catherine Murphy, had come through the Workers' Party, Democratic Left, which then joined in with the Labour Party. And the third founder was Stephen Donnelly, who later moved to Fianna Fáil and was Minister for Health and was doing pretty well, to be honest, but lost his seat today. And that was the biggest scalp of the election. So those are the, if you like, next layer. And those two parties are the ones that Fianna Fáil is doubtless now deciding how to negotiate with. And then you've got a number of others. The Green Party, as I said, had 12 members in the outgoing Dáil and is down to one. Again, we could discuss at length why that happened. They've been very successful in delivering on their promises, but I notice in the manifestos of the other two government parties, they're claiming full credit, each one of them, for the most outstanding policy changes that came from Green participation. And then we have a number of others, something called People Before Profit Solidarity, which could be roughly described as the Trotskyist Party of Ireland. And they are going back with 3 members and a plethora of new ones, some of them very suspect indeed, and little more than one-man bands. And under the graphs and things you'll see online, they tend to be grouped under others, independents and others. I had an interesting, wonder if I can find it, message today from what I describe as my correspondent in Donegal. Let me get it now. Unfortunately, there were several independents running on an openly racist, anti-science and pro-conspiracy platform in Donegal. Thankfully, all were resoundingly rejected by the electorate. And that's really interesting in a broader sense. That was from Jason Toby from Cardiff, from Grangetown, who's now living in Donegal. These type of parties, which have suddenly materialised basically this year, were probably part of an international US-inspired anti-immigration movement. And you will have, over the last year or so, you may have heard about the various pretty awful things that were happening around immigrants. Places that were meant to house them being burnt down, immigrants being attacked, etc., etc. They managed to get various groupings or individuals managed to get onto a couple of councils during the May local elections. But by now, I think maybe it's getting through to people that they're not the patriotic saviours of the white Irish nation that they were putting themselves forward as. That's simplifying, but anyway, they haven't got anyone in. Alex, have I left out anybody that I should have?
Well, I was going to say to Alexander, it seems to be, although you've touched on it, Lila, a little bit of a gap, in most of Europe and obviously what we see in America. There is this sort of very well-organized, well-funded populist right that seems to be gaining attention and momentum. But I am aware of some more right-wing parties in Ireland, Alexander, but it doesn't seem to be as prevalent, this sort of populist right. Even Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael that tend to be more sort of, right-wing Lib Dems and Conservatives rather than that kind of party, right?
Yeah, and I think
Sorry, terribly sorry. Aontú is the one I forgot to mention. You take over from there.
Yeah, I think Aontú have 2 or 3 seats this time round. I think previously they had one with is it Pader Tobin was their one TD last time. But yeah, I think the electoral system kind of plays a huge part in sort of pushing down the radical wings, because we don't have sort of a plurality system like the UK has. You really are dependent on appealing to a spectrum of voters and relying on those transfers to push you over the edge. So I think a large part of not seeing this sort of far right populism in Ireland is a result of the electoral system itself. I think even, as Lila pointed out, the Independent Ireland Party, which is this is the first time they've run for the Dáil, I believe. This is really just sort of a collection of independents that decided to sort of group together. I believe they were already elected as TDs previously. And so they've sort of, instead of just caucusing together, they've just sort of reached out to someone at a marketing firm and rebranded themselves as a party, really. So I wouldn't really say that there's a radical right party. It's really just three guys who decided to say, oh, let's do this instead. But yeah, and then also just one really interesting thing in from my own work on lobbying is that Donegal now has a TD from the 100% Redress Party, which emerged out of sort of a advocacy movement. For context, there was a huge issue with housing materials in mainly in the western of Ireland. Correct me if I'm wrong, mica brick production, something like this. Basically, the bricks, literal bricks that the houses were built of, are crumbling, and so they looked for some sort of financial compensation from the state. And yeah, this advocacy movement decided to run a candidate and now has an elected TD. So it's kind of odd now from a lobbying perspective, because to be a lobbyist or an advocacy individual, you can't be elected. So I'm kind of like, what are they now? But I think that speaks very highly to the very local nature of Irish politics. You can have this single issue, local concept, and now you're in the national chamber of parliament making policy or voting on policy that's very not local.
Alexander, we've touched on it a little bit in what we discussed already, but just if, in case any of our listeners aren't aware, what the electoral method and the makeup of the Dáil is that sort of guarantees that coalitions are required. We know it's STV, obviously. I mean, there's been lots of people in Wales who have advocated for moving either the UK Parliament or especially the Senedd. I think they would expect quicker results than this, though. But like we said, it's been going on since Thursday, the counting now. We're only really just about to get to the end, right?
I mean, I would say that I was quite impressed with the speed this time round. I believe it was 2020 we were waiting. I mean, a government didn't form for weeks. But yeah, I was kind of impressed with the speed. But I mean, in Ireland, all the ballots are hand counted, they're hand transferred. It's not like the US or anything like that where you press a button and you have a result. But elections really are a sort of a sport. We enjoy watching them in Ireland. So I was quite disappointed that it's over so fast, actually.
This was a very speedy count, and you've already touched on it, Alex. The last time round, it took about a week for the final count to be completed, but it took 4.5 months for a government to be formed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Don't think we're looking at quite that length of time, but it's unlikely we'll have a new government before Christmas, although the Dáil will be reconvening on the 18th. It's not very likely they'll be asked to vote on election of a new Taoiseach government. So just wanted to throw that in. It is a sport. I'm glad to hear that described that way. We enjoy our elections, those of us who are interested, and you might get more people interested, Matt, if you had something as complex as that. On the other hand, people do get a bit going, when you mention the way it works here. So it's such a simple thing, this straight first past the post, but it's not particularly democratic. And we've seen that in recent years, where really quite low percentage of voters can elect a government with almost dictatorial powers, if it wasn't for the restraints imposed by whatever the opposition is in Westminster. I'm probably being a bit partisan there, but I do think that involving people, having to think through what they really want, which their preferences really are, is good for democracy. Although the turnout is slipping over recent years, and it was just tipping 60% this time, which here wouldn't be considered so bad, but in a country that used to have traditionally high turnouts, it's not so good.
I mean, a lot of people are concerned as we head towards the Senedd election that people will struggle to understand the hunt, but for people counting it, it's going to be a much easier job than this. A little bit discussing about a brief history of coalitions, really, in Ireland. Obviously, proportional systems tend to lend themselves to coalition building. But I mean, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael one of them has actually always been in charge of Ireland. But in terms of how many parties have been required in that government, that's changed a little bit over time as well, right? So it used to be either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil and another, and now they tend to coalition with each other as well, plus another, just to make sure. What does that sort of say about the changing nature of politics in Ireland, that those sort of mainstay parties have started to really decrease in the vote, because essentially you could argue that they are the same party that game the system using PRSTV in order to be able to get up to a slightly higher vote share than they would if they were one party.
I can't resist throwing in that the first coalition was formed in 1948, and that was led by Fine Gael and had all other parties except Fianna Fáil in it. Since then, there was a period when it was seesawing between those two main parties as the leader of it. But there's been a big change in this century due to a particularly traumatic and dramatic incident, the financial crash in 2008. Fianna Fáil and the Greens were in a coalition at the time, and they were blamed for what happened, the really massive austerity that followed. The only way that global institutions would bail them out was by that they had to accept guidance from something called a troika. So after that, in the 2011 election, the Greens were wiped out, and it looked as if Fianna Fáil could be as well. But they've come back really quite strongly given the circumstances. Then from 2011 to 16, you had Fine Gael leading with Labour. And it reached a point where Labour thought they might be the biggest party at the next election. Eamon Gilmore was being touted as their next Taoiseach, and it all fell apart again because they had no option. They were not able to argue against what was imposed on them. And it led to people losing trust in those two parties as well. So you had four parties there, all of them with, reasonable things that they could claim to have achieved, and part of it just being getting Ireland out of special measures really quickly before any other country. But tell that to the voters when they're suffering, and that's why you're now down to this kind of scenario. You've got this background, this financial, this economic background, and it's still really relevant.
It does seem like the smaller parties in coalitions in Ireland, in a lot of places around the world, but specifically in Ireland, they do seem to be punished, don't they, for being part of those coalitions. So what's the incentive?
Power, or the perception of such. Yeah, the small parties always, I'm like harking back to my undergrad days with Michael Gallagher at Trinity telling me why they were punished. But I feel like the smaller parties, on one hand, the larger parties need them to obviously form a majority. So they have a lot of leverage in that regard, but then they don't tend to always be given the most wonderful ministerial portfolios. And they also tend to be the ministerial portfolios that, I guess, everyday policies or things that people interact with every day, whether it be housing or health or education, may be sort of split off more likely to the smaller parties. And so they're the tangible things that the voters can relate to. So, for example, the Minister for Health, I know he's not from the smaller party. He didn't get re-elected this time round in the wake of us building the world's most expensive children's hospital. I think it's at about 2.5 billion at the moment. So I think if you put someone in a ministerial post that it's easy to point the finger at, which these smaller parties tend to do, that tends to happen. I think this time round, though, in particular, the Greens suffering so much, I think it's sort of the cost of living crisis paired with the idea that the Green Party in Ireland and elsewhere takes a far more long-term approach to politics, because, of course, climate crises are a long-term objective. They're not going to be solved in the next 5 years. It's the next 50 or 100 years. And so that involves paying costs up front now to lower costs in the future. And in the midst of cost of living crisis and everything else, people don't want carbon tax or things like that. So that was the cause this time around. I don't know whether that's true for previous small parties.
So the cost of living crisis was one of the key issues in this election, as I'm sure it is in basically every election that's taken place in the last couple of years and probably in the next few as well. But Lila, what other key issues were sort of in voters' minds when they were making that decision this time around?
Well, the cost of living, yes, was way up there, but housing was above it in the exit poll.
Yeah.
But not as high a percentage of people, for example, necessarily gave it as their main complaint this time. Health was a really major one in the last election, but the percentage giving it as their main concern dropped pretty dramatically from, I think, 30 something percent 4 years ago to 17% this time. And honestly, quite a few improvements have happened. Stephen Donnelly was getting on with it. On a personal level, I could quote family experiences, that I've been amazed at how quickly some people have got hospital appointments, treatments that we'd be waiting a hell of a long time for here in Wales. So it's not as if there wasn't progress on those main concerns, but there are major problems in the sectors, specific sectors mentioned as well. There are also, in that exit poll, if I may come back to it, there were some anomalies. More than 50%, I think 51%, said that the government hadn't done enough on the climate change problem, but hardly anyone voted for the Green Party. Which is really, really hard to work out, except that I think Alex put his finger on it. Those small parties get given really difficult and complex portfolios. And now the big parties are talking about carving some of those portfolios out. For example, setting up a separate ministry to deal with things like immigration, which was in Roderick O'Gorman's portfolio. He's the leader of the Green Party, who's the only one who has kept his seat out of those 12. But he suffered terribly. There were homophobic attacks. He was blamed for everything, going from things that happened before he was born, in the case of the children's homes, which is another long story we don't want to get into right now, to whatever number of immigrants were entering Ireland. Yeah, you're right, Alex. It really is one of the crosses that must be borne in order to have influence. And the Green Party was trying, let's face it, as you say, they take this longer term view, and that is always harder to communicate when especially if people are feeling the pinch. However, Ireland is now a rich country.
Well, I was just going to say, Ireland finds itself in a staggeringly good financial position. The EU forced them to take the money of American tech giants against their own will. How much did that play into the election? Because for me, this does kind of feel like an election result where the economy is doing well, where the incumbent major parties of government have survived what felt like a significant challenge from insurgent parties. Alexander, do you want to talk a little bit about that financial situation and how it provides a bit of background to the election?
So I think Ireland, as you mentioned, is sort of in this unusual situation. We basically have more money than we can spend, and perhaps a little more money than sense. I think one of the things that I get, and it touches on what Lila mentioned, is housing was a really important issue in this election. It was a really important issue in the last election, but Ireland also has one of the highest home ownership rates in Europe. So I think this sort of vote for continuity of the major large political parties rather than change, you could probably draw a pretty strong line between people having this artificial sense of wealth through home value and economic stability for that, and sort of the relatively smaller cluster of the electorate that don't own their homes. I don't know whether you'd agree with that or not.
That's part of it, I think, yeah.
I think there is, on the face of it, Ireland is doing quote unquote well. And then I guess the typical demographics that tend to vote tend to be older, tend to be employed, tend to be the people who are benefiting from this situation relative to the other demographics who tend to vote less. So students, younger people, unemployed. But I would suspect that that's sort of leading into some of it.
Lila, it does feel a little bit like as well that despite this feeling like an election in good economic circumstances where incumbents have done well, it does feel like there is this deep sense of inequality within Ireland that is sort of festering under the surface, which it does explain why Sinn Féin have done so well and why some of these more right-wing parties have started to pick up votes as well. Is that accurate?
Somewhat. Wouldn't go all the way. Let's face it, I'm pretty old. I grew up in the second half of the mid to second half of the last century. So I remember when my dad had to emigrate. He was an economic migrant, which is what they're opposing coming into Ireland now. But I remember how difficult it was. We were never hungry, but we had very little. Nowadays, it is assumed that everyone can go out as often as they like, have everything they want, and that's very nice for them. I'm not being a begrudger by any means, but the transformation is truly historic, given Ireland's history. So yeah, I'm always a little bit sceptical about some of what is said about inequality, and there is inequality, and show me the country in the world that hasn't got it. And there are pockets that are really, really worrying. I don't think anyone really knows what to do about certain bits of Dublin. The very fact that this crook, this gangland convicted gangster, got out of jail in Spain, where he was being held on money laundering charges, to go back and contest the election in Ireland, and came very close to getting elected, really does raise a question about how some people feel about the wealth and the extravagance they can see around them, as opposed to their own conditions. And that's particularly acute in part of central Dublin and the areas in which these gangs have been very active. So that's the downside. But fortunately, Labour took the seat. So that was incredibly embarrassing, I think, for the entire political system if the guy known as the Jerry Hutch, the monk, something like that he was called, had actually got elected to the National Parliament.
So let's talk a little bit about the campaign. The election looked like a three-way tie for the biggest party between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin. What did the parties do or try to do to move the needle? And were they in any way successful? Alexander, I don't know if you want to start us off and then we'll move to Lila.
So I think the polling leading up to the election basically had them head to head. I think the actual sort of first preference distribution has about 1% between each of those parties, so they're relatively level. I know, as you mentioned earlier, the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, both their manifestos sort of claimed the benefits for what they had done and sort of left the Greens out of it. I think Sinn Féin did pretty well in sort of linking their transfers to Social Democrats, which has also led a few Social Democrat candidates to get pushed over the quota or to be elected, in some instances, to be elected over a second or a third Sinn Féin candidate in some constituencies. So I think one thing that I should flag, though, I think I mentioned this at work when I was speaking to Richard, was I found it very unusual. There was sort of this lead up to a campaign being called. Everyone knew that there was going to be an election, but for about 2 or 3 weeks, like, it didn't exist. So no one had called it yet. Everyone knew it was going to happen. I was getting advertisements online for the Green Party general election raffle and draw. I was getting sort of sponsored posts about your general election candidate in Dublin Southwest, etc., etc. But I hadn't been called yet, which I thought was very odd because we're pretty strict on the campaigning structure in Ireland. I believe once the election is called, then campaigning can start for a maximum of, I think, something like 30 days or thereabouts. So it's a very short period, but it was very odd to have this going on before. I also saw my first ever campaign advertisement on television. That's a new concept in Ireland, which was a Fianna Fáil TV ad with Micheál Martin smiling and walking around some places, sort of advocating for the party. But because we have such small budgets per candidate, as permitted by the Electoral Commission, we don't get TV ads. It's all retail politics and posters. So yeah, and the lead up to the campaign was kind of odd. That hasn't strictly answered your question, but it was unusual in terms of campaigns and how they normally go, I would say.
It's a difficult question, Matt, but there are rules, there are legal constitutional requirements around elections, and Alexander has referred to some of them. One of them is that there has to be maximum term of 5 years for a Dáil, and the time was approaching. It would have had to be called by March, so everybody has known forever, more or less, when it was going to happen. But after Simon Harris became leader of Fine Gael and Taoiseach, following on from Leo Varadkar stepping down in March, that party got a huge bounce. So it being in the Taoiseach's hands to decide what date he wants to go for, there really wasn't much to do other than wait for the actual official calling of it, which, by the way, has to be done through a visit up to on Oris, the presidential residence, for presidential permission. They knew what was coming. They knew what they could say. They're clearly all of their manifestos are pretty extensive, some very much so, and particularly I think the Labour and the Social Democrats had laid out their stall vastly long ago in preparation for what they knew would be a tough time for them, but they knew there was some chance of them becoming a bit stronger and likely to be in talks about coalition. We're leaving Sinn Féin out of it, and we shouldn't, because they were the big story of the last election in 2020, and they stayed high for quite a while, and then they did a lot of talking, they did a lot of shouting, but the people weren't seeing a lot coming out of it. And then they were hit by the paedophile scandal a few months ago in Northern Ireland, followed by more sex scandals in the Republic, followed by some TDs stepping down and running as independents. And there were various other things, but those were the ones that really looked as if they were going to be a big problem for them. But amazingly, they seem to have got over it. So the question is, how did they overcome that? One of it was that with their famed discipline, possibly given their background, they bussed a lot of people into the border counties in particular. So they brought a lot of people in from Northern Ireland to canvass and help in general. That must have been part of their recovery story. But it wasn't enough for them to become the real contender for top party.
So when the polls closed on Thursday, the exit poll came out.
Yeah.
It said that it looked like Sinn Féin could possibly be the largest party. We've got the most of the seats in now. I think we're waiting for a couple. It looks like Sinn Féin will finish second, but it doesn't look like they'll finish first. They can't finish first by any way. And even if they had been, both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil had said that they wouldn't work with them in government. So are Sinn Féin essentially locked out of government forever? And for those who, again, don't necessarily have the full understanding of the culture and the history of Ireland, why would that be the case, Alexander?
I wouldn't say they're locked out forever. I think a lot of the, particularly Fianna Fáil not going into government with Sinn Féin comes from sort of the position of Fianna Fáil's leadership. I know there's some members in Fianna Fáil, like Jim O'Callaghan, who kind of was tipped to maybe be next leader of Fianna Fáil a couple of years ago if Martin was to step down or if there was a change, had sort of signaled that he would go into government or would be more open to the idea of going into government with Sinn Féin based on the idea that, harking back to sort of Civil War politics, Fianna Fáil is the Republican Party. That is their slogan still today, actually, I believe. And Sinn Féin adopts an all-Ireland approach. So ideologically, from that position, there is a natural fit. But I think Lila's pointed to this already as well, I think there's a lot of the population that perhaps are uncomfortable with the idea. I myself am not uncomfortable with the idea, but I was born in 1997. I've grown up with the Good Friday Agreement and the idea of peace on the island. So I don't fully buy into it, but I do understand that people who did, maybe from my parents' or grandparents' generation, were watching the news or listening to the news, are a little more hesitant to lend their vote. But I think as time moves on, I think that will become less and less the case. But yeah, I don't think they're locked out forever. I think it's it's whatever way the wind's blowing on the day and whoever's in leadership of the other parties. But I do think it's far more likely that it will be Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin based on their sort of, I guess, philosophical foundations relative to Fine Gael. And to be quite honest, it's more unusual that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael went into coalition in the last election than anything else, I think. I mean, for about 100 years, they were completely opposed to the idea of joining forces and going into coalition. And here we are, and they are now sort of the setting the standard for future governments, sort of having a Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and maybe a spattering of independents or a small party in between. So, people of my parents' generation would have written that off completely and said that was never going to happen. And here we are. So I wouldn't completely write it off.
Yeah, on a purely practical of the moment point, Sinn Féin can't get the numbers to form a government right now.
No.
It would take a lot of change. And I would like to back up Alex's point about generational approaches. He's a peace baby, and I lived through the 30 Years' War. I've seen the effect of bombings. I know people who've suffered losses and so forth. And I'm afraid there is a bit of more than a bit, an attempt to rewrite history. And while I think and welcome the fact that they appear to be committed to the democratic process now, it's hard to believe that there has been a sufficient generational change for a majority of the Irish voting population to want to be willing to see them lead the government in the Republic. There's something else I would like to mention. Alex is absolutely right about Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin being closer together than one would expect either of them to be with Fine Gael, for example, or with Labour. Though there are a couple of things there. Fianna Fáil always got a huge working class vote historically, particularly in Dublin, actually. They are still, in many ways, portraying themselves as a party of the working class. And Micheál Martin takes every opportunity to put down people from a privileged background like Mary Lou MacDonald or Richard Boyd Barrett by reminding people that his father worked on the buses and he was the first in his family ever to go to secondary school, never mind university. Likewise, the current leader of Fine Gael comes from a humble background. That was even more unexpected. His father was a taxi driver. His mother is a special needs assistant. So that in itself is kind of an indication of how the political allegiances are changing in a class sense in Ireland. And then there's the question of Northern Ireland. Once again, Sinn Féin has pushed it up high up front really in its manifesto, and is calling for a referendum soon. However, Micheál Martin took a very much more nuanced and clever, I think, approach to it by setting up a particular special unit in the Department of the Taoiseach with real serious funding to promote collaborations across the border. And he and most people believe that whatever happens, it should be done in a peaceful, agreed manner. It might end up meaning that you don't have formal territorial reunification in the way everyone has always assumed it happens. It may be that it has to be on a case of two political entities agreeing to work together in a framework, something like the UK in a sense. There are other variants on it as well. But collaborative, gently bringing the unionist population along and isolating the extremes there. So that's what he wanted to do, and he made sure the government of Ireland made money available for that. And it may well be that that's the way that particular change will come about, rather than the head-on, let's get it all done and dusted in 5 years approach that Sinn Féin is still espousing. Though I suspect that they know well that that's not what's going to happen. They are not stupid.
Well, much was made, wasn't it, about the prospect of two Sinn Féin governments in Ireland and how quickly we would see a united Ireland as a consequence. But we seem not particularly much closer or clearer to that than we were before this election, which is going to make all those Star Trek fans who like the Irish reunification of 2024 joke make them feel a bit uncomfortable. Okay, so we've got pretty much every result in now. It does look like Fianna Fáil will be in Irish election terms by some way clear, with Sinn Féin in second and Fine Gael in third. What do you expect to be the sort of key elements of coalition formation in terms of what both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will try and do with their mandate?
I think one of the big things that's going to have to be discussed in the coalition formation process is actually who's the Taoiseach. And I know that sounds kind of silly. But prior to the last government, it was just the largest party took the Taoiseach for the term. That was it. The second largest party took the Tánaiste, or the deputy PM spot. But for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to go into government last time, they adopted this almost sort of rotating Swiss-style system where one would take it for a couple of years and then they'd swap over with a handshake, and the other one would take the reins for the rest of the period. And I think this has kind of set the baseline for future coalitions when you have large parties. So I think the first thing that's going to be discussed is if this Swiss style system continues. I call it Swiss style because that's the only thing I can relate it to. If that is the case, there'll be the question of if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael need a third party to go into government with them, will that third party be offered a period of leadership? As was the case, I believe, with Eamon Ryan of the Greens, and he turned it down in the last election. If it is Labour, I would say that they would want it for a period. But looking at the outstanding seats, I think they're only going to need one or two, maybe three to make a majority. And one of the unusual aspects of Irish politics is that independents are absolutely overrepresented in terms of numbers, a proportion of the seats. I think there's like almost 20 or something like that now. So some of these independents do actually align very closely with the values of either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael and would often vote alongside them or vote with the government on many issues. So it may be the case that just they join in. So I would say that's going to be a bit of a debate, is simply who and when those individuals will become the leader. In terms of specific policies, I don't know, maybe they're just going to fight over who can spend the 16 billion or save it from Apple. But can I say Apple, or do I have to say tech conglomerate? We can go with Apple.
It's Apple. It's fine. It's Apple. Lila, what do you think?
I'm just looking at the latest numbers. Fianna Fáil is going to have the Taoiseach job because they've soared ahead.
So you don't expect there to be the rotating Taoiseach situation this time around?
They've got 44 now. So there may be something, but it's not looking as if they need to argue too much over that one. I would have said the same as you, Alexander, an hour or so ago, but it's looking as if Fianna Fáil is well in the lead now. So then it comes down to they're hardly going to want two extra partners in government. So will it be Labour or will it be the Social Democrats? What do you think?
I don't think Social Democrats will want to relive the experience of the Green Party that they've just gone through. And I think also, while Labour makes sense in terms of stability for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, I think Labour, in particular, Ivana Bacik as the Labour leader, will be thinking beyond the Dáil, I would say. I'm a former student at Trinity. She was a long-term senator of Trinity, and she's long been tipped as someone who would be a very strong candidate for the presidency, and I think the presidential election will be in the next year or two. So I think being in government makes going for the presidency a little more difficult because you're a little more constrained in what you can say. So I think that might also be in the equation for whether or not the Labour Party is committed to go in. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael won't want, I don't think, any of the other smaller parties because they're kind of fringe parties. So I think it's probably likely to, if Labour's comfortable to go in and Ivana Bacik isn't considering the presidency, then it'd be them. Otherwise, maybe a couple independents.
So this is very interesting, isn't it? So the Dáil's due to sit again on the 18th of December. I'd like to proffer a couple of scenarios here. So what do you think the chances are of a government being formed by then? And what kind of percentage chance do you give to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael having to operate as a minority government because those other smaller parties have seen what's happened to the Greens and seen what happened to Labour in the past and gone, no, we don't want any of this?
I mean, we've had governments previously where it has been larger parties and a couple independents. And because politics in Ireland is so local, and if you do run as an independent, you're not as likely to be punished at the next election because your re-election is really based on your network rather than your abilities. There's a couple candidates down in Kerry that I think people would question their accolades over all else. I won't name them, but I'm pretty sure you know who I'm talking about, Lila. So, I mean, we had, I think it was the 2015 election was Fine Gael, and Shane Ross, I believe, was Minister for Transport. He was an independent. Catherine Zappone was Minister for Children, Equality, whatever the rest of the title is. I don't think it's a risk. I mean, these are independent candidates that have largely perhaps campaigned on very small local issues and are being offered potentially a ministerial position. If it was me, I would jump at the chance. So I don't I don't see that being too much of an issue. And like I said, I think there's a good chunk of independents that run as independents are independents, but on many issues actually align, particularly in rural constituencies, with the larger two parties, Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. So ideologically, not too far from those parties and would fit very comfortably within a coalition with them.
Lila, the last word goes to you.
I think there's something in what you've said, but there are some looming problems that the government may be looking for a safer shield, and Labour does offer that more readily than the Social Democrats or any combination of independents. There are some independents who are actually clever, like Michael Lowry, and could really contribute, but he's very independent and they wouldn't be able to depend on the likes of him to just toe the line. So the sort of thing coming up relates to the international scenario. Ireland's thriving, but it's getting about 30% of its corporate taxation from just 10 companies. If even a couple of those ups sticks due to what Trump decides to do come January, then they do have to have plans in place for how they're going to handle the fallout. There are scenarios coming up in Europe that leave them with similar problems to face. So I do think they'll be looking for people who would be able to contribute on that side as much as anything. So it's a bit premature to think, oh, are they just doing a numbers game? I think they're thinking beyond that. Micheál Martin, anyway, will be thinking beyond that. It's the way he works. So yeah, I would, if I were him or any of them, I would be looking for a way of ensuring that we have the right options if the bonanza from inward investment becomes endangered. I'm not saying for a minute that all of these companies, Pfizer and the likes, are going to up sticks and go, but already they're expanding in Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, which benefited from experience of Ireland, and in Ireland, many of the people. So yeah, those are the kind of things that didn't get discussed much in the election campaign, but will be coming to the fore.
Well, thank you both so much. I've enjoyed talking to you immensely this evening. If people want to hear more from you on social media, where can they go and find you? Lila?
I'm still on the X Factor. Lila Eilish on that.
Thank you. Alexander?
I mean, I'm on Twitter/X. I'm Alexander Fitz _, but I'm far more of a cyber stalker and news upkeeper than anyone who voices things on there. But yeah.
Fab. Thank you very much. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at HiraethPod. You can go to our website at www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/HiraethPod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.